Welcome back to Historical Secrets, where stories that seem to have vanished in the mist of time are brought back to light. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or empires, but about icy warriors, those who dared to sail across the frozen northern seas when even fire itself refused to accompany them, the Vikings. Before we set sail with them across ice covered waves and uncover the remarkable secret of how they kept warm without fire, do me a small favor. If you love exploring history in a different way, full of emotion, full of surprises, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and stay with me until the end of this video, because you won't believe what the Vikings did to survive that frozen hell. Now, pull your blanket closer, take a deep breath, and let me tell you the story of humankind defied the cold and its own limits. Snow fell endlessly on the wind-filled sails, covering every rope and every damp plank with a thin, glimmering layer of ice. In the dark and merciless North Sea, where each wave felt like a freezing blade slashing against the skin, the Vikings still rode, silent and steadfast. They were not seekers of death, but people who had learned to live with it, beside it, facing it, and sometimes even mocking it. That was what made them legends. But if you imagine life aboard a Viking ship as thrilling, full of cheers and heroic songs echoing across the sea, I'm sorry, you're gravely mistaken. The truth was far colder and harsher. That life did not shine with the glory of conquest. It reeked of sweat, rotting fish, and damp straw. Every day, the Vikings fought not only against the sea, but also against their greatest enemy, the cold. That cold was unlike anything we can imagine. It didn't just make hands tremble or lips turn blue. It was an invisible creature creeping into every fiber of cloth, every crack in the wood, and every breath. It made every movement a battle, every sleep a punishment. You didn't feel alive anymore. You were merely trying not to die. And in that circumstance, amid the frozen ocean, those rough men created a culture of survival that was almost sacred, beginning with the very thing they called the sleeping fire, a small symbol of hope. Sleeping fire, it sounds poetic, but in reality, it was the Vikings' greatest invention at sea. A small iron or clay pot filled with glowing embers, buried in ashes to preserve heat. No flickering flames, no dancing light, only a faint warmth seeping from the smoldering coals, like the shallow breath of someone drifting to sleep. Yet, it was the heart of the entire ship. When you live on a floating coffin made of tarred wood, the last thing you want near you is fire. But for that very reason, the tiny ember became absurdly precious. It was both a survival tool and a sacred object. Because in the midst of darkness and storm, amidst crashing waves and howling wind, even the smallest light could keep a person from going insane. Each morning, as the dim dawn broke over the sea, one crew member was assigned to lean down and gently blow on the pot of coals to awaken it. There was no ritual, no prayer, but in that moment, amid the freezing air and deadly silence, seeing a spark glow again was a small miracle. It told them, we are still alive. Strangely, in the modern world, we seek warmth from electric heaters and luxury blankets. But for the Vikings, that warmth came from faith, the belief that as long as the embers still glowed, there was still hope. They called it the flame of endurance, a fire that did not warm the body, but the spirit. From today's perspective, that crude technology seems unimpressive. But imagine this. On a winter night in the Arctic, as wind whistled through wooden planks and seawater froze on your beard, just one tiny spark. You would cling to it as if your very soul were being warmed. That is the essence of survival. There were also times when the embers spilled, scattering across the deck. Then the whole crew would leap up like panicked firefighters, shouting, stomping, praying to every Norse god not to let the ship turn into a giant torch. Most of them survived, and that only made them believe Odin was smiling in the snowstorm. In some wild way, that faith kept them going. The truth is, the Vikings never saw the sleeping fire as merely a tool. It was the soul of their journey. When the ship finally reached shore after weeks adrift, they didn't celebrate right away. They first awakened the fire, letting it blaze again. They gathered around it not only to warm themselves, but to feel the victory, not over enemies, but over the sea, the cold, and their own fear. That fire, if you look deeper, was the perfect symbol of the Viking spirit. Stubborn, resilient, and never extinguished. Small but persistent, fragile yet immortal. And while most of the world at that time lived within the borders of safety, the Vikings dared to challenge nature itself, carrying nothing but a few glowing coals and the faith that they would survive. If you've ever wondered what drove those people so far, from the frozen lands of Norway to Greenland, even touching North America, the answer doesn't lie in maps or navigation. It lies in a small box of embers, and in the hearts of those who believed that even in the darkest night, light would endure. They did not warm themselves with fire, they warmed themselves with willpower. And perhaps that is what allowed the Vikings not only to survive the frozen seas, but to live forever in the memory of humankind. Imagine yourself beneath that ship's tent, a heavy, damp sheet dripping water down your neck, fluttering with each northern gust as if it too were about to give up. The air underneath is thick, filled with the smell of sweat, animal hides, salt, and something modern scientists might call condensed human vapor. Every breath is a small cloud, evaporating and condensing right above your face. And in that small, moldy world, the Vikings endured. Not because they weren't afraid, but because no one dared be the first to admit maybe we should go home. The ship's tent wasn't a shelter. It was like throwing a wet blanket over a nightmare. You don't escape it, you just make it more suffocating. Rainwater seeped through the stitches, dripping steadily like the ticking of an hourglass counting down to mental collapse. Each drop was a reminder that out there, nature was still winning. But somehow the Vikings turned endurance into ritual. They told stories, sang, or occasionally argued about the philosophy of war between shivers. Viking songs weren't grand or echoing like in the movies. They were hoarse, weary, sometimes just muttered half asleep phrases to forget the cold. In fact, perhaps that's why their sagas were so long. When you're trapped in damp darkness with 30 men and no Netflix, storytelling is the only way to stay sane. Tales of Odin, of Valhalla, of battles where everyone dies, they sounded grim, but they were a kind of spiritual medicine, helping them believe that if they froze to death tonight, at least they'd be greeted with beer and honor in the afterlife. Inside that trembling fabric, faith was the only remaining form of warmth. Strangely, when you live long enough in hardship, you start calling it normal. The Vikings did that. They called it hverdag, everyday life. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was the only thing they knew. And it was precisely that normalization of pain that made them invincible. While other civilizations built temples and cities to resist nature, the Vikings accepted it, letting it teach them how to become tougher than the ice itself. On stormy nights, when the ship tilted and the sea growled like a hungry beast, someone would perhaps light the sleeping fire, the small ember still glowing faintly inside its iron box. Not to warm themselves, but to remind each other that something still hadn't gone out. A spark so tiny you had to squint to see it, yet strong enough to make everyone fall silent and stare. In that moment, between darkness and impending death, a small light could become the entire world. That wasn't just a survival technique, it was a symbol of humanity defying the indifference of the universe. And when the storm passed and the sea calmed, the Vikings rode on. No celebration, no rest. They simply did the only thing they knew: move forward. They didn't ask why. They just knew that somewhere beyond the waves lay glory, gold, or at least a patch of land that might be a little drier. That's what drove them. Not victory, but the idea that the cold must eventually end. Perhaps that was their true secret. Not strength, but the ability to endure in hopelessness. They didn't fight the cold. They lived with it, negotiated with it, and sometimes laughed in its face. A Viking might lose all feeling in his feet, but still joke that at least now he couldn't smell the rotten fish on the ship anymore. Humor, to them, wasn't joy. It was armor. It's astonishing to think that those men, filthy, frozen, and half asleep, were the ones who explored nearly all of Europe, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even America. They had no compass, no engine, only calloused hands, relentless will, and a stubbornness that could make even Odin sigh. That's what set the Vikings apart. They didn't wait for fair weather to sail. They believed that if you wait for the wind to stop, you'll never leave the shore. Beneath that heavy tarp, the Vikings learned lessons the modern world still struggles to grasp. That sometimes warmth doesn't come from fire, but from faith. Faith that you'll live to see the sunrise. That comfort doesn't lie in avoiding hardship, but in knowing how to laugh in its face. and that the most fragile things, like a coal in an iron box or a wet sheet at sea, can become symbols of strength if you know how to keep them alive. They weren't just pirates, they were proof of how absurdly adaptable humans can be. When the world said, "That's unbearable," the Vikings replied with action. "We already did it." And perhaps that's what made them immortal in history. Not their conquests, but their survival through things no one was meant to survive. When the sun finally rose, shining through the mist and reflecting off their soaked shields, they probably didn't smile. They just looked at each other, nodded slightly as if to say, "Another night has passed." And then, as always, they raised the sails and headed toward the cold horizon where wind, sea, and fate still awaited. The brotherhood of the Vikings was not forged in blood on the battlefield, but in the freezing nights on a merciless sea, when the cold crept through every grain of wood, every vein, and death sat patiently beside the hull. They learned to lean on each other not only for warmth, but for sanity. In the darkness, there were no generals, no slaves, no titles, only people shivering together under a torn piece of cloth, breathing the same misty air, waiting for dawn as if it were a delayed miracle. There, amid the groans of the wind and the crackle of breaking ice, a strange kind of bond was born. Not love, not friendship, but a covenant of survival. A sacred silence among those who had decided they would not die tonight. When a Viking fell ill, no one left him behind. Not out of compassion, but because he still gave off heat. And to the Vikings, heat was more precious than gold. They shared everything: blankets, food, even the illusion that tomorrow would be warmer. One man coughed up blood, another simply patted his shoulder as if to say, "Hold on a little longer, we need your breath." In their world, kindness wasn't spoken, it was sitting close enough to shiver together. And in that sharing, they found something even the gods envied: the unyielding spirit of humans facing hopelessness. When dawn came, the light did not banish the cold. It only revealed the faces of those who had survived, cracked, bruised, but alive. They stood slowly, rubbing their hands together, tightening their cloaks, and smiled. Just a small smile, twisted by wind and pain, but it was the smile of victory. They knew they had never truly fought an enemy outside. Their enemy was the cold, the darkness, the sweet whisper of despair saying, "Lie down, rest." And each morning they answered it by rowing on. The Vikings had a strange philosophy about pain. If it doesn't kill you, it becomes part of you. The cold wasn't just a challenge, it was a teacher. It taught them humility, gratitude for every breath, and the understanding that true strength lay not in muscles, but in endurance. When the body no longer responded, willpower was the final flame still burning. And that was why they became legends. Not because they didn't fear death, but because they refused to let that fear stop them from living. Some stories say that sometimes they sang to keep warm. Their voices were hoarse, cracked, sometimes reduced to groans, but to them, that was fire. The singing echoed over the frozen sea, mingling with the sound of waves and creaking ropes. The songs weren't about glory, but about faraway hills, homes, and the smell of hearth smoke. Music reminded them that the world had once been warm, and as long as they remembered that, they still had a reason to survive another day. The longships of the Vikings, wooden dragons slicing through the raging sea, were not just vessels of conquest, but symbols of indomitable spirit. In every curve of the hull was the sweat and tears of those who built it. In every shield hung along the sides was a prayer to the gods. And in every voyage, the ship carried not only people, but hope. The hope that one day they would find a land where the sun was no longer a stranger. When you stand on deck and look out to sea, all you see is infinity. No destination, only the journey. But the Vikings understood that the journey itself was where they found themselves. They needed no comfort, no fame. They just needed a reason to keep rowing. And sometimes that reason was simply the person beside them, the one shivering in the same rhythm, breathing in the same rhythm, and still alive. Modern scholars may explain their resilience through physiology, climate, or warrior culture, but that overlooks the most important part: the heart. The Vikings survived not because they were the strongest, but because they were never alone. In a world where death lurked everywhere, they turned camaraderie into a kind of magic. With no fire, they burned with faith. With no roof, they found shelter in each other. With no promise of heaven, they created their own Valhalla upon the cold waves. And when night fell again, they lay close together, mending torn cloaks, telling stories of gods they hoped were listening. Perhaps Odin truly existed, perhaps not. But what's certain is that in the darkness of the northern seas, the Vikings found something both gods and men longed for: the warmth of courage. Because in the end, survival is not just keeping your heart beating, it is the art of keeping faith alive, even when the sky no longer shines. And in that art, the Vikings were masters. Amid the frozen ocean, they didn't just keep each other warm, they kept the spirit of humanity alive. Imagine you are a Viking, standing in the middle of the North Sea in winter, where the sky and the water blend into a seamless gray with no boundary. There is no land, no light, only the sound of the wind howling as if it were laughing in your face. Your skin burns from the ice, your hands are cracked, your breath turns into thick fog. In that moment, the only thing keeping you from death is not your cloak, not fire, but willpower. A will forged by generations who learned to see the cold as part of themselves. The Vikings did not survive because they avoided hardship, but because they embraced it, even loved it, as a worthy adversary. There were no luxuries on the ship. No hearth, no fur thick enough, only linen, sealskin, and damp planks of wood. They understood that warmth did not come from possessions, but from movement, from heartbeat and breath. Each stroke of the oar was a challenge hurled at the cold, each rhythm of song a declaration: I am still alive. On the long ships, music became a substitute for fire, unseen, yet radiating power. The singing not only kept their rhythm, it kept their souls. When their mouths stiffened with frost, they still tried to sing, as if stopping for even a beat would make death smile. Music, to the Vikings, was human magic. They sang not to appear brave, but because in their songs they found one another. A group of men huddled close, beards frozen, voices hoarse, still joined in a rough, endless chorus. Each song was an invisible thread binding wandering souls in the icy sea. When they sang, fear took shape, took sound, and when something can be sung, it no longer rules you. That was how the Vikings faced the madness of the ocean. They sang louder than it. The cold was never the only enemy. The real enemy was despair. In the darkness, where the line between life and death blurred, despair whispered in your ear, just lie down, just for a minute. And that was when the Viking spirit rose, a defiance beyond reason, the arrogance of those who kept going when every logic told them to stop. The Vikings believed that endurance was proof of worth. They did not seek safety, they sought significance. They wanted to leave a mark, not just on maps, but in human history. And the paradox was that the cold, the pain, and the scarcity were what shaped them, like the wind carving the face of a mountain. If you think they were only savage warriors, you underestimate the intelligence in their survival. At sea, they carried no fire, but they had living coals, small boxes containing smoldering embers kept dry and warm in animal hide. Whenever the ship reached land, those embers were used to rekindle the first fire. They knew that a single spark could save the whole crew, but could also burn it all down. So they did not see fire as a friend, but as an untamed god who demanded respect. The Vikings lived in paradox. They feared fire, yet worshipped it. They hated the cold, yet relied on it to grow stronger. The cold taught them patience, and fire taught them limits. In every voyage, they carried both, one as a trial, one as salvation. Perhaps that is why Viking culture is full of opposing symbols: war and peace, death and glory, ice and fire. Everything was two sides of the same coin, and they learned to live in between, choosing neither side. While modern people seek comfort, the Vikings sought challenge. They believed that the soul only truly heated up when placed on the edge of extinction. Hardship didn't numb them, it made them more alive. A Viking child was taught to endure cold before learning to light a fire. A Viking man was praised not for victory, but for the ability to endure defeat and still hold his head high. To them, pain was not something to be avoided. It was a greeting from the gods. The songs on the ships were not just music, they were ritual. They sang to stay warm, to remember home, to honor the fallen. When storms came, when ropes strained to breaking, when the ship screamed like a dying beast, the singing continued. That was how they fought madness, turning fear into rhythm, chaos into melody. Men who had cursed each other over a piece of dried fish now harmonized like brothers. On the cold sea, they found a warmth no one expected: connection. And it was that connection, not fire, that was the secret to Viking survival. None of them were strong enough to defeat the cold alone, but together they created something the frost gods could not touch: the human spirit. They did not wait for the sun to rise to feel warmth. They became their own sun. In every song, every stroke, every glance was a declaration of a species that smiles in the face of adversity. When a Viking said he survived, it did not simply mean he was still breathing. It meant he had found beauty in endurance. He had learned to laugh in the storm, to sing in the cold, and to believe in the dark. They had no fire, but they had each other. And perhaps that was stronger than any flame. Because in the end, on the frozen sea, what kept them warm was not temperature, but pride, song, brotherhood, and the belief that as long as the heart still beats, the flame still burns. The Vikings did not carry fire. They carried the spirit of fire and made themselves torches in the endless winter night. Within the cold walls of the Tuda monastery, where prayers echoed through moss-covered stone corridors, the battle between soul and flesh never ceased. The monks, clad in ash-gray robes, bowed before the statues of saints, yet their hearts still beat in rhythm with the world outside, a world of flesh, of desire, of profoundly human weakness. They were taught that temptation was the voice of the devil, but sometimes in lonely nights, that voice sounded like the only comfort left. Every morning they awoke to the sound of prayer bells, their breath faint in the cold air. They recited scriptures, hand-copied sacred texts, and believed that each stroke of the pen brought them closer to salvation. But at night, when candlelight trembled against the stone walls, the thoughts buried all day rose again. Some begged God to drive temptation away. Others stayed silent, letting it sweep through them like a winter storm, knowing that resistance only made instinct stronger. Tuda was not merely a monastery. It was a spiritual experiment where men tried to strangle their human nature with discipline and failed beautifully. For in truth, no prayer was strong enough to extinguish the flame burning within the soul. Those monks were not sinners. They were simply men trying to live beyond their limits, and in that effort, they became more human than ever. In the diary of an anonymous monk found centuries later in the crypt of Tuda, there was a scrawled line: "I saw God in the eyes of a woman, and I do not know whether I have sinned or been saved." A sentence that was both confession and declaration. It revealed a truth the church never wished to admit, that between asceticism and desire lies only a fragile thread, and sometimes it is woven by God's own hand. For if God created humans with longing and emotion, is it truly a sin to feel them? Tuda became the place where that question lingered in every footstep, every breath. The young monks, imprisoned by vows of chastity, still heard the wind carrying the scent of distant fields, the laughter of village women, the music from taverns they would never enter. And slowly, they learned to compromise with faith. They called desire a trial, a stolen kiss a momentary lapse. They confessed, prayed, and repeated. Strangely, that cycle did not destroy the monastery. It sustained it. Because it was precisely that contradiction between holiness and sin that became the force keeping their belief alive, the belief that they could still be forgiven, the belief that no matter how many times they fell, God's hand would still reach down. In a world where every desire was considered blasphemy, to long for something became an act of rebellion. And Tuda, built to suppress instinct, accidentally became a secret shrine for forbidden feelings. Beneath the robes and rituals, the human self still existed, weak, yearning, afraid, and sometimes radiant in its shame. Another monk, during confession, once wrote, "I do not know which is more frightening, the devil or loneliness itself." Perhaps that was what everyone in Tuda felt, but never dared to say aloud. Because in a place where silence was a commandment, repressed thoughts were the loudest noise. And from those whispers, Tuda gave birth to its own kind of religion, a religion of contradiction. There, people did not believe in perfection, but in the strength to endure their cracks. They prayed not just for forgiveness, but for the courage to keep sinning meaningfully. It was the truth the church never voiced, that sometimes sin itself drives people to seek faith. Without desire, there would be nothing to redeem. As centuries passed, Tuda's stone walls began to crumble, but its story did not. Historians, when discovering the old manuscripts, were astonished by the raw honesty in every line. There were no lies, no embellishments, only humanity, sacred and fallen, fearful and brave at once. And perhaps that is the truest image of faith. Not pure light, but a small flickering candle struggling to exist amid the darkness of instinct. Over time, Tuda ceased to be a symbol of holiness. It became a lesson that every ideal, no matter how noble when pushed to extremes, gives birth to its own reflection. Absolute purity breeds desperate desire. Too much prayer breeds too much truth whispered. And in the war between spirit and flesh, there are no victors, only humans, lost, fragile, still trying to believe in something greater than themselves. For in the end, Tuda was not just a monastery, it was a mirror. And in it, we see not only the monks of the Middle Ages, but ourselves, still struggling between what is right and what is real, between what we should do and what we cannot resist. And perhaps, if there is anything that brings us closer to God, it is not perfection, but the courage to admit that we have never been perfect at all. Within the cold stone walls of Tuda, where light entered only through small windows like wounds on the wall, love and sin found each other in silence. When night fell and the echoes of prayers faded into the damp wind, the world inside the monastery stirred, not by miracles, but by the quickened heartbeats of humans suppressed for too long. The men who passed through those gates, priests, confessors, or caretakers of the monastery, did not all come with dark intentions. Yet, in a world where power wore a sacred robe, a glance or a gentle word could turn into a weapon. Many priests claimed they only wished to help lost female souls, but the way they spoke of sin was too delicate, too human. A kind gesture could so easily slide into intimacy, and in the darkness of the confessional, the line between redemption and surrender blurred. Some surviving records from the 15th century recount discreet investigations by the church. A young nun was accused of falling in love with a visiting priest, but her written statement only said, "I believed it was love, not sin." Those simple words, written with trembling, blurred ink, left the entire council of bishops at a loss. For how could one punish someone merely for feeling the warmth of another human being? The church never admitted such things. They called it the weakness of the flesh, the temptation of Satan. But deep down, the monks knew the truth. It was only the natural reaction of a soul imprisoned too long. The prayers and confessions repeated day after day like an endless refrain had suffocated emotions until they became distorted. When people are forbidden to love, every gentle gesture becomes a ritual, every touch a miracle. There exist confiscated letters from Tuda that still baffle historians today. One begins with a prayer, "May God protect the soul of the one I love," and slowly drifts into vivid expressions of longing, woven between the divine and the earthly. The writing was not that of a rebel, but of someone desperately trying to convince themselves that love could also be a form of prayer. Not all the romances within the monastery were acts of sin. Some stories, passed down through rumor, tell of couples who found renewed faith within their own transgressions. A monk, defrocked for breaking his vow, fled Tuda with a nun. They lived in hiding in a small seaside village where she opened an inn, and he taught children to read the scriptures. Villagers said they always prayed together before meals as if their love was still a form of worship. Perhaps in their defiance there was more faith than in all the hollow sermons of the cathedral. However, most were not so fortunate. When scandals were discovered, punishment came swiftly and cruelly. The nun was locked in a cold room, her hair cut off, forced to fast until her body gave in. The confessor was reassigned, often to the harsh borderlands, where cold and loneliness were deemed fitting penance for desire. Yet punishment never cured instinct. It only drove it deeper. And within those stone walls, where wind howled through corridors like strangled prayers, sin sprouted again, quietly, persistently. What is remarkable is that, though all of this happened in the shadows, the villagers around Tuda seemed to know. In taverns, they whispered of the priest and his housekeeper, of Sister Mary, who vanished one winter and returned thin as a ghost. Yet no one dared to speak against it openly. The church was the only warmth they knew in that frozen age, and perhaps they understood that even those in holy robes were simply seeking a bit of warmth, just like them. That was the most beautiful and tragic paradox of Tuda. The place built to destroy desire became the place that proved its power. Every cold stone, every mournful hymn became the backdrop for a deeply human tragedy, the struggle between faith and instinct, vow and yearning, sanctity and love. As time passed, those sins did not vanish. They turned into legend, retold as ghost stories or warnings. But if one listens closely, there is no sound of demons, only the sighs of people forced to choose between their faith and their hearts. The forbidden touches, the half-burned letters, the unfinished confessions all spoke of one simple truth. Even within the walls of Tuda, where souls were said to belong to God, people still longed to be human. And perhaps that, more than sermons or punishments, was the truest proof of their nature. Weak, passionate, yet radiant and sincere to the very end. For in a world of stone and crosses, only love, whether forbidden, twisted, or silent, was strong enough to keep the heart beating. As the Reformation spread across Europe, the walls that once hid prayers began to crack. In the cold light of a new religious dawn, monks were no longer seen as symbols of absolute faith, but as men struggling with the darkness within themselves. At Tiuda, where prayers had once echoed like endless rivers, different sounds now filled the air, whispers, doubts, and sometimes the quiet laughter of those who knew that holiness was no longer absolute. In the remaining pages of old journals, one finds trembling handwriting. I prayed for my soul, yet my eyes searched for her among the pews. I know it is wrong, but I also know it is real. No one knows who wrote it, but the words seem to speak for thousands of suffocated hearts beneath monastic robes. It was the moment when religion ceased to be salvation and became the burden of conscience. People often think of the Reformation as a storm that swept away the church's sins. But if you look closely, it was not purification. It was an exposure where ancient secrets were dragged into the light and given new names: justice, reform, God's truth. Yet what it truly revealed was not the sins of the clergy, but the raw truth that humans, even those in sacred garments, could never escape instinct and loneliness. In the dissolved monasteries, people found love letters, handwritten music, small gifts wrapped in rough cloth. Each object told a story the royal inspector's reports could never comprehend, that sometimes, in a world made only of doctrines and decrees, to love was the bravest act a person could commit. When Henry VIII declared his break from Rome, England's religious world was turned upside down. But strangely, this so-called liberation did not make people purer. Sermons were translated into English, new hymns were written, yet the soul of the church remained unchanged. On the pulpit, preachers proclaimed that believers could now speak directly to God, without the Pope as an intermediary. But below, in rooms dimly lit by candlelight, they still prayed for forgiveness for the things Scripture never taught them how to control: desire, fear, and the longing to touch another's hand. Historians call it the paradox of post-Reformation faith, but those who lived through it probably just saw themselves repeating an old cycle, only now sin had a royal license. In the countryside, the old Tuda monks were replaced by priests loyal to the king. Some married, more open, seemingly happier, but many others sank into a new kind of sin, the sin of pretense. They no longer had to hide in darkness, but instead hid within the light. Folk songs began to circulate in taverns. My priest preaches of heaven, but holds the housekeeper's hand before dawn. People laughed, yet beneath that laughter lay deep understanding. They had long grown used to humanity's failure before its own ideals, and perhaps that made them more forgiving, more grounded, and sometimes kinder than the preachers of mercy themselves. Ironically, the very scandals that royalty exposed to disgrace Rome only made the people realize a universal truth: no one is innocent. What was called purification was merely a change of address for sin, from the Vatican to Westminster, from chapel to palace. But wherever sin resided, it still bore the face of humanity. The 16th century ended with two parallel images: a New England, prosperous and ambitious, and a church wearing a freshly polished robe of holiness, brighter but emptier. While kings fought over the right to bless, the rural priests still struggled with the same ancient question: how to love without sinning. The answer was never written. For today, though only a small fragment of history's vast mosaic, had already revealed what every religion tries to avoid saying aloud: that humanity cannot be saved from its own nature. They could change laws, language, and theology, but never erase the heartbeat beneath every hymn, the heartbeat of a heart longing for what is forbidden. In the end, The monks of Tuda were neither sinners nor saints, but the truest witnesses of their age, an age where morality was measured by how well one hid desire, not by how one faced it. And it was there, in the space between prayer and sigh, that history found its truest form. That faith and desire are not opposites, they are merely two directions of the same soul, seeking meaning. Imagine you are a young merchant from the city of Chang'an in the 9th century, packing shimmering rolls of silk thin as breath, before stepping out of the city gates. Ahead of you is not a road, but a promise stretching for thousands of miles. The caravans march westward across the Gobi Desert through lands where the wind and sand can bury an entire city after a single storm. Yet amidst the dry death of the desert, humanity found a way to survive together. In the caravanserais, the fortresses of merchants, the very soul of the Silk Road. At night, the flickering firelight dances on stone walls. Amid the groans of camels and the howling wind beyond the gate, life continues. A monk from Nalanda tells stories about the Buddha's teachings to an Arab scholar, who, in return, responds with the philosophy of Aristotle. Nearby, a Persian jeweler teaches a Chinese potter how to mix sand with copper oxide to create green glass. And in a corner of the courtyard, guards share their dinner: flatbread, dried meat, and a few grains of salt, a luxury for those who've spent the day battling sandstorms. Caravans did more than sustain trade. They kept civilization from falling silent. There, religions did not wage war, but conversed. Art was not imposed, but exchanged. And language, instead of being a barrier, became a bridge of words linking the world together. A Persian poet once wrote, "In the caravanserai, I am no longer a stranger, for everyone here is weary, as I am." Perhaps it was that very weariness that made people more compassionate, more open to stories from distant lands. The world within the stone walls of the caravanserai was a miniature society, where everything happened within a few hours: bargaining, learning, loving, betraying. Some nights, a storyteller would stand in the courtyard, light a torch, and tell legends of Alexander the Great marching across the desert, or of a Chinese emperor sending a letter to the god of the wind to bless his merchant's journey. Each tale was a thread woven into the grand tapestry of human history, where ideas traveled faster than goods and beliefs were traded more freely than silver or gold. Astonishingly, from those caravans, the modern world began to take shape. Arabic numerals, the compass from the East, silk weaving techniques, glassmaking methods, even the recipe for paper, all were once carried within those dusty journeys. A merchant might leave Persia with frankincense and return with the astronomical knowledge of Chinese scholars. This road did not just transport goods, it carried curiosity, faith, and dreams. Yet, not everyone returned. The road demanded a terrible price. A single sandstorm could swallow an entire line of camels, and the goods would vanish as if they had never existed. In the frozen rock caves of the Pamirs, people still find camel bones and silver bracelets, the remains of buried dreams. But every time one caravan was lost, another would set out, as if the lifeblood of humanity was nourished by the very desire to go farther, regardless of danger. And when you think about it, these caravans didn't just connect lands, they connected time itself. Every footprint in the sand was a reminder that this world was never truly separate. Somewhere, an Italian merchant was holding a mirror made in China, seeing himself reflected in another civilization's light. And far to the east, a scholar was copying the ideas of Plato with a brush and black ink, believing he was continuing a dialogue that began thousands of miles to the west. The caravanserais also taught us this: civilization is not conquest, but sharing in solitude. No empire was ever strong enough to command the desert. Only cooperation between guides, blacksmiths, cooks, merchants, and dreamers made the journey possible. In the dim light of dust-covered walls, a world was built. A world founded on trust in strangers. And when dawn broke, the heavy gates would open once more. Bells rang, camels were tied together, and loads were fastened tight. The leader looked to the sky to find direction, while the cook gathered the ashes of last night's fire. No one knew if they would reach the next stop, but everyone knew why they had to go. For them, the Silk Road was not merely a place of trade. It was where humanity learned to become itself, amid different languages, different faiths, and a shared dream of existence. Today, those caravanserais are only ruins, gray stones lying still among the sea of sand. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the distant echo of camel bells, the notes of Persian instruments mingling with Chinese wind chimes. For history, like the desert sands, only seems asleep. In truth, it is still shifting, whispering through every story we retell. And perhaps it was there, in the warm darkness of an ancient caravanserai, that humankind invented globalization, not through contracts or treaties, but through the trusting eyes of strangers sitting together by the fire, sharing a bowl of water and a dream, that this vast world can still be connected through hospitality and kindness. From above, the Silk Road looks like a silver thread stretched across the continent, but on the ground, it is a living pulse where people, goods, and ideas endlessly circulate. As the sun sets over the Gobi Desert, the caravans awaken once more. Torches flicker against stone walls, camels snort, and in the courtyards of each caravanserai, the world begins to move again. Blacksmiths strike their hammers on saddles, cooks stir pots of spiced stew, and storytellers begin to speak, as if every night were a new dawn of civilization. What made these places extraordinary was not merely the intersection of empires, but the way they preserved the warmth of humanity in a world of constant change. Behind every journey was an intricate infrastructure where engineering, organization, and knowledge blended into one. Every brick of a caravanserai was a testament to the ingenuity of ancient architects. They understood the traveler's needs, not only for shelter from sandstorms, but for a place where both body and soul could rest. Walls half a meter thick kept heat from escaping at night, while ventilation holes high above allowed moisture and smoke to drift out. At the center stood a well or small pool, both a source of life and a sacred symbol of survival amid desolation. Every detail had a purpose. The main gate was large enough for camels to pass through, yet there was only one entrance, ensuring both security and peace of mind. And when night fell, the entire building seemed to close in upon itself, becoming a self-contained world, a fortress of life in the sea of sand. But that life was not mere survival. It was art. In the dim light, dust-covered walls still shimmered with intricate carvings, Indian lotus flowers interwoven with Persian geometry, Arabic curves merging with Central Asian domes. It was a shared language where each engraving was a greeting between civilizations. On some nights, the notes of a rabab mingled with Chinese flutes, and in the open courtyard, a Turkmen dancer spun within clouds of incense, her hands sketching the very map of the Silk Road itself. The merchants, after a long day battling the wind and sand, sat around the fire to share something more precious than gold: knowledge. A jeweler from Isfahan taught a Chinese apprentice how to refine silver. A weaver from Kashgar demonstrated how to dye fabric with turmeric. And a Syrian cook recorded the recipe for milk tea from a Mongolian traveler. Human creativity spread not through books, but through meals, conversations, and chance encounters. It was in these places that small ideas took root and traveled the world with the caravans. From a kitchen by the desert, a noodle recipe reached the Mediterranean. From a humble monastery in Taklamakan, Buddhist philosophy followed merchants' footsteps to Japan. From a quiet courtyard in Sarai, medicinal formulas written in many languages became the foundation of Eastern and Western healing traditions. Every exchange, however small, was a heartbeat in humanity's shared pulse. And among the weary travelers, the caravans also rekindled faith. A monk struck his wooden bell in one corner, a priest lit candles in the next room, and a Sufi meditated by the well. They did not argue. They simply coexisted, as if in the desert, humankind had learned to respect difference. In a world divided by borders and creeds, these places taught tolerance. Perhaps the Silk Road carried not only goods, but compassion itself. But like all things in history, this light did not last forever. As empires fell and maritime routes replaced the overland roads, the caravanserais slowly decayed. The wind blew through their domes, and the walls that once echoed with laughter now whispered only the rustle of sand. Yet the bricks still hold memory. Still, they remember every footprint and every conversation that shaped the world. Today, archaeologists and travelers visit these ruins not merely to admire stone and brick, but to feel the connection between human beings. In them, they find something deeply modern: the idea that globalization was not born in the 21st century, but is an ancient legacy kindled by caravans when night descended. And perhaps if you stand quietly in a roofless sarai in Iran or Uzbekistan as the night wind sweeps through the cracks in the walls, you may still hear distant echoes, music, laughter, and voices of hundreds of tongues blending into a wordless symphony. A world where people knew no borders, only the journey. Thus, the Silk Road was not merely a trade route, but a mirror reflecting the soul of humanity, fragile yet enduring. It teaches us that every civilization begins with an encounter between person and person, between faith and doubt, between dust and moonlight. And though the caravans have long vanished, their legacy remains in every road, every dish, every song, and every belief we share today. That road still exists, not beneath the camel's hooves, but within us, those who continue the journey of exchanging, listening, and understanding one another. And that is the greatest treasure the caravans left behind, an eternal lesson in connection, trust, and the yearning to cross all borders to truly reach each other. When Ibn Battuta left Tangier, the world before him was not a map with clear borders, but a vast tapestry woven from roads, temples, languages, and human dreams. He did not merely cross geography, he crossed the very spirit of humanity. Every land he reached was another chapter in the living scripture of hospitality, trade, and faith that the Silk Road had written through the centuries. When he arrived in Cairo, the domes of the city seemed to mirror the sky he had left behind, but filled with colors and voices. There, he learned that the Islamic world was bound not only by prayer, but by people moving between the capitals of scholarship, commerce, and the sacred. From Egypt, he continued across the Arabian desert, where the sun melted everything except human will. He passed endless caravans. Merchants he had only heard of as a child now stood before him in flesh and bone, people who had lived their entire lives among sand and stars. On freezing nights, when the wind whispered through the dunes like the sighs of the past, Ibn Battuta realized that he was no longer just a pilgrim. He had become part of an ancient tradition, the tradition of storytelling. Every campfire was a doorway, opening to countless voices, merchants speaking of the Arabian Sea, monks of the Himalayas, and nomads telling of ancestors who had watched the Milky Way drift above their heads. When he reached Mecca, the holiest of places, he saw not only a religious center, but a crossroads of the world. Those who came brought not only offerings, but knowledge, skills, technologies, and sometimes rumors capable of altering the fate of empires. Ibn Battuta, endlessly curious, began to collect it all, not just in his memory, but in his soul. He realized that movement itself, not the destination, was the true source of wisdom. And when he left Mecca, instead of returning home, he went farther, eastward, toward the rising sun and new stories waiting to be told. In Persia, he witnessed a radiant civilization, where caravanserais rose like stone palaces amid the sands, each one a miniature universe of the world. He dined with Indian merchants, listened to Persian poets recite the verses of Rumi, and watched scholars debate astronomy beneath the night sky. Everyone he met was a link in a chain of knowledge stretching from Athens and Alexandria to Samarkand. It was here that he grasped what would only centuries later be named global knowledge. When he reached Delhi, Ibn Battuta was received by Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq as a scholar, but the Indian court was not only a place of golden power, it was a crossroads of worlds. Within the palace, he met Central Asians, Persians, Arabs, and Africans, all speaking of lands that no map at the time could capture. There he was appointed a Qadi, an Islamic judge, yet his heart never rested. For Ibn Battuta, every judgment he gave only deepened his hunger to understand the essence of humanity. And so he went on, this time across the seas towards Southeast Asia. The Arab ships, their sails filled with wind, carried him to the spice islands of Indonesia, where the air was thick with cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. There he witnessed a world where trade and faith intertwined. Monks from Sri Lanka and merchants from Yemen prayed side by side before setting sail. Port cities like Malacca and Aceh became nodes of the maritime Silk Road, where culture spread faster than the monsoon winds. His journey also took him to China, where he was awed by the scale of the cities, the elegance of the bridges, and the bustling silk markets. In Hangzhou, he wrote that he had never seen a place so beautiful and prosperous. He saw craftsmen as meticulous as monks, merchants as courteous as scholars, and Buddhist temples soaring into the misty sky. Though he did not fully understand the language, he grasped something deeper, that every civilization, however different, was built upon the same yearning to find meaning in the journey. After 3 decades, Ibn Battuta returned home. He had become a different man, not just a scholar, but a mirror reflecting the world. His story was recorded in the Rila, the Journey, a magnificent chronicle of humanity's connectedness long before maps, satellites, or the internet. What he described was not merely geography, but the way people understood one another through words, gestures, and faith. The world Ibn Battuta explored now lives only in books, but his spirit endures in every modern traveler, from wanderers seeking experience to scientists linking global knowledge. Like the ancient caravanserais, his journey reminds us that every road, no matter how distant, leads to the same destination: curiosity and humanity. And when you glance at the crisscrossing flight paths on today's world map, remember they are the descendants of the trails Ibn Battuta once crossed on horseback, camel, and faith. The Silk Road may be buried beneath the sands, but every click, every message, every journey we take is another thread woven into that great tapestry. For as Ibn Battuta once wrote, travel not only expands the world, it expands the soul. When Ibn Battuta set foot in Delhi, the world seemed to open a completely new chapter, a place where power, opulence, and paradox coexisted in the heartbeat of the greatest Islamic empire of the subcontinent. The city of Delhi under Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a whirlwind of prosperity and chaos, where gold flowed like rivers, and so did schemes for power. Amid the towering walls of fortresses and the bustling streets, Ibn Battuta saw not just a city, but a world within a world, where faith, knowledge, and human ambition intertwined like endless rivers. He did not come here with heavy luggage, but with his greatest treasure: intellect and curiosity. It was this that caught the Sultan's attention. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a ruler famed for his brilliance yet notorious for his volatility, quickly recognized in Ibn Battuta a man not only versed in Islamic law, but also gifted with a rare, profound understanding of human nature. In a court where words could save or kill, his calmness and scholarship were priceless assets. The Sultan appointed Ibn Battuta as Qadi, judge of the royal court, a title both honorable and perilous. He was given the power to adjudicate disputes among merchants, scholars, and even members of the royal family. From a traveler, Ibn Battuta became a living witness to one of the most complex eras in India's Islamic history. Yet, amid power and opulence, he still sensed the fragility of human life, where faith could easily be overshadowed by ambition's shadow. Every day in the palace was a lesson. He saw envoys from Persia, Turkey, Yemen, and Central Asia, all converging in Delhi, turning it into the crossroads of the Islamic world. Majestic mosques echoed with prayers, mingled with the sound of drums and Eastern instruments. In the markets, spices from Malabar blended with incense from Java, while African traders sold ivory and amber beside Persian jewel carvers. During royal assemblies, Ibn Battuta observed quietly, not with the eyes of an official, but of an anthropologist far ahead of his time. Yet the sultan he served was not merely a scholar, but a man of tragic contradictions. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was known for his bold and often disastrous reforms. He ordered the capital moved from Delhi to Daulatabad, forcing tens of thousands to migrate under scorching heat, leading to thousands of deaths along the way. He attempted to issue copper currency in place of gold, hoping to make finance accessible to the poor, only to plunge the empire into a sea of counterfeits. Ibn Battuta, as an insider, witnessed it all. He not only recorded events, but felt the pain of a dynasty trying to move ahead of its time on unsteady legs. During his years in Delhi, Ibn Battuta grew to both admire and fear his king. He once narrowly escaped execution when the Sultan suspected him of conspiring with rebels. A rumor, a wrong glance, either could have cost him his head. But instead of fleeing, he chose to observe and to write. In every page of his record, he carefully described the structures of power, the opulence of the court, and the small, fragile moments of humanity. Servants sharing bread, monks praying quietly for peace, or children chasing camel caravans through the city gates. These details made Ibn Battuta's journey one of the most delicate engravings ever made of the human soul in the Middle Ages. Eventually, when the chance to leave Delhi arose, he did not hesitate. The Sultan, knowing his vast travels across the Islamic world, entrusted him with a grand mission: to serve as India's ambassador to the Yuan dynasty in China. It was the dream of any traveler to go farther, to reach lands that existed only in legend. With an escort of merchants and warriors, Ibn Battuta left India by sea, heading for Southeast Asia, the maritime Silk Road he had once only heard about in stories. That journey, like all his others, was anything but easy. Fierce tropical storms drove his ship to the Maldives, a chain of islands he would never forget. There, he was reborn once again, from exiled ambassador to the judge of an island kingdom. He married, learned the local language, and observed a society where Islam blended gracefully with native culture, a delicate dance between faith and nature. He wrote about the women of the Maldives with rare reverence for his time, independent, educated, and active in community life alongside men. From the Maldives, he continued to Sri Lanka, then Sumatra, then China. In every place, Ibn Battuta realized that the Islamic world was not a monolithic block, but a symphony of cultures, religions, and intellects. He wrote of Chinese craftsmen as meticulous as monks, of gentle Buddhist monks, and of the brave Javanese sailors. To him, Islam was no longer just a faith, but a universal language of hospitality and knowledge. 30 years passed, and Ibn Battuta returned home a changed man. He had traveled more than 120,000 kilometers, farther than Marco Polo, and recorded his journey in the Rihla, the journey. His work was not just a diary, but a living map of a world connected long before real maps existed. In it, every person was a story, every land a lesson. Ibn Battuta had not only journeyed across space, but through the essence of humanity, where faith, curiosity, and the hunger for understanding became the greatest power mankind ever possessed. And so, when the sunset descended over Tangier, the place he once left with bare feet and a burning heart, Ibn Battuta returned carrying not treasures of gold, but the treasures of human souls he had met along the way. For, as he once wrote in Rila, there are no borders in the world, only roads, and God has given us feet to walk upon them. When Ibn Battuta set foot again in Tangier, he carried on his shoulders not luggage, but an entire world. Yet what made him great was not the more than 120,000 kilometers he traveled, 3 times the distance of Marco Polo, but the way he saw the world, not through the eyes of a conqueror, but with the heart of a learner. In the final years of his life, as he recounted his journey to the scholar Ibn Juzay, his voice was not that of a braggart, but of a man still wandering through memory. He said that, though he had passed through storms, deserts, and royal courts, what impressed him most was not gold or palaces, but the invisible thread that connected humanity. In Delhi, he saw devotion turn into cruelty. In the Maldives, he saw power arise from trust rather than the sword. In China, he saw order stronger than faith. And everywhere, he saw one thing that never changed: human beings, no matter how different, still seeking meaning in their existence. It was then that Ibn Battuta realized the real map of the world was not drawn on parchment or silk, but in human memory. Every city was a story, every face a chapter. He had met pilgrims who walked for months just to reach Mecca. He had spoken with merchants from Mogadishu who could name every monsoon wind as if calling old friends. And he had heard songs from the island of Sumatra echoing across the sea, making him feel that the world was never divided. We simply had not stepped out to see it. In the Rila, his journey was not merely a travel diary. It was a mirror reflecting the soul of the 14th century world, a world without clear borders yet deeply connected, where Arabs traded spices from India, the Chinese exchanged silk with the Arabs, and Africans brought ivory to Persian ports. Every ship was a bridge linking civilizations that seemed distant, and Ibn Battuta was the man who crossed all those bridges on his own feet. In China, he wrote that he saw gigantic ships with dozens of sails, crafted with such precision that they could withstand storms without sinking. He compared them to the dhows of the Indian Ocean, smaller but resilient, and wrote, "The sea takes no sides, it only tests the courage of men." Astonishingly, though he wrote in the 14th century, Ibn Battuta described the world as a proto-global network, where religion, trade, and culture mingled like ocean currents. In one place, he prayed in a mosque. Just a few miles away, he heard temple bells ringing. For him, difference was not a barrier, but proof that God had many languages to tell the same story. Yet, what made his journey truly extraordinary was the price he paid for that understanding. He had been robbed, shipwrecked, and imprisoned. He had seen friends die in the desert and ships swallowed by storms, and still, he kept going. In a rare note, he wrote, "I fear that if I stop, my heart will turn to stone." Perhaps it was that fear of stagnation, fear of ceasing to explore, that made him an immortal symbol of the spirit of discovery. If Marco Polo described the world through the eyes of a European merchant, Ibn Battuta did the opposite. He told the story of the world through the eyes of the East, where Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Confucians coexisted within a sacred space. His journey expanded not only the map of geography, but also the spiritual map of humanity. Imagine this: a man setting out from Tangier, a small town on the Atlantic coast, traveling as far as Beijing, the Maldives, Mali, and Mogadishu, in an age without GPS, printed maps, or precise compasses. He relied only on the stars, on the words of locals, and on the belief that a road always exists if one dares to walk it. That was Ibn Battuta's greatest legacy: faith in the journey itself. He taught us that the world was not made to be feared, but to be explored, and that every step, no matter how small, makes the world a little larger. When he died, no one knew his exact resting place. Tangier, Fez, or Marrakesh all claimed to hold his tomb, perhaps because the world was too vast and no single place was large enough to contain him. But in a deeper sense, Ibn Battuta never left. Every time a traveler departs from home, every time someone looks at a map and wonders what lies beyond the horizon, Ibn Battuta lives once more. His journey did not end in the 14th century. It merely changed form, from dusty roads to words, from deserts to the memories of storytellers like us. For in the end, what he left behind was not a list of places, but a philosophy that the world does not belong to those who stand still.